The laughter outside the courthouse stopped when John Grady looked up, but Pearl Ramsey was already unfolding the letter that told her the wedding was over. She had crossed half the country to marry Edward Mills, and now he couldn't even meet her eyes. Pearl folded his letter with steady hands, refusing to give Dry Creek the humiliation it expected. Then she noticed the final warning. Whatever else happens, don't mention Ramsey Crossing to Sloan. Across the street, the towering cowboy everyone feared watched her pick up her own valise and chose not to interfere. Pearl had never heard of Ramsey Crossing, but Ramsey was her father's name. Would you have left town or stayed to find out why? By the time the stagecoach rolled into Dry Creek Junction, the afternoon had gone the color of old iron. Pearl Ramsey saw the town through a window filmed with road dust. A row of false front buildings stood against the cold Wyoming sky, their signs knocking softly in the wind. Beyond them, the country opened wide and pale toward the Wind River foothills. Brown grass bent flat beneath the gusts. Farther west, snow already showed along the higher ridges. The driver hauled back on the reins. The coach rocked once and stopped. Pearl waited while a salesman climbed down ahead of her. Then she gathered her skirts, took the driver's offered hand for exactly as long as she needed it, and stepped onto the hard-packed street. 5 days of travel had settled into her bones. Her dark green traveling dress had been brushed clean that morning, but Wyoming dust had found it again. Her bonnet had lost some of its shape. One glove had split near the thumb. She carried a brown leather valise in one hand and a small tin document box beneath her other arm. She looked up and down the street. No Edward. The driver lowered her trunk beside the station platform. "That all, ma'am? That's all." He climbed back onto the box. Pearl stood beside her luggage as the stagecoach rattled away. Across the street, 3 young ranch hands outside Doyle's livery had stopped talking. Near the general store, 2 women carrying market baskets glanced toward Pearl, then toward the empty road behind her. Pearl knew what they were waiting to see. So did she. Edward Mills had written that he would be there before the coach arrived. He had described himself standing beside his gray wagon, wearing the brown coat his sister had made for him. He had even joked that Dry Creek was too small for them to miss each other. There was no gray wagon, no brown coat, no Edward. A thin man in a wool vest came out of the station office with a freight manifest in his hand. "Miss Ramsey?" She turned. "Yes, Mills' bride from Missouri." The words traveled farther than he probably intended. One of the ranch hands across the street looked over again. Pearl set the tin box on top of her trunk. "Pearl Ramsey," she said, "and yes, Mr. Mills was supposed to meet me." The station agent glanced toward the road. "Haven't seen him. What time is the courthouse closed?" That seemed to surprise him. 5, usually. Pearl checked the small watch pinned inside her coat. 23 minutes past 4. Edward had written that they would register the marriage that afternoon, then ride to his ranch before dark. Pearl picked up her valise. "Which building?" The agent pointed down the street. "Brick 1 past the Mercantile. Thank you. What about your trunk? I'll return for it." She started walking. Dry Creek Junction was smaller than St. Joseph and rougher around the edges. Wagon wheels had cut deep grooves into the street before the ground froze. Hitching rails stood crowded with saddle horses. Smoke from coal stoves drifted low between the buildings, carrying the smells of leather, manure, wood smoke, and coffee from a dining room somewhere nearby. Pearl had imagined this street more times than she cared to admit. Not exactly this street, but something like it. Edward beside her, a ranch somewhere beyond town, a kitchen table where she could keep accounts in the evening, a small corral of her own one day. She had never told Edward how much she wanted that last part. Not fully. Her father had taught her that a good horse could change a small rancher's year. A steady cow pony saved time. A properly gentled team saved broken harness, ruined wagons, sometimes broken bones. Pearl had spent 7 years around freight horses and ranch buyers. She knew what she could build if she ever had enough ground. Marriage had never been the whole future. It was supposed to be the beginning of one. A gust caught her skirt as she crossed in front of the mercantile. Someone behind her said, "That her?" Another voice answered too quietly for the words to carry. Pearl kept walking, reached the courthouse steps with 9 minutes to spare. The front door opened. Edward Mills came out. Pearl stopped. For a second, relief moved through her so quickly that she almost smiled. Then she noticed what was missing. No wagon, no flowers, no preacher. Edward wasn't even dressed for a wedding. His coat was dusty at the elbows. His hat was crushed between both hands. He looked thinner than the photograph he had sent her in June. Pearl. She waited. Edward came down one step. "I'm sorry." The relief disappeared. Pearl's fingers tightened around the handle of her valise. For being late, Edward looked past her toward the street. No. The courthouse door closed behind him. He held out an envelope. Pearl looked at it but didn't take it. "What is that?" "Something I should have sent sooner." "Then why didn't you?" His jaw worked once. "Pearl, I can't marry you." A wagon rolled somewhere behind her. Harness chains jingled. A horse stamped against frozen ground. For a moment those ordinary sounds became very clear. Pearl finally took the envelope. Edward lowered his voice. "I know what this looks like. I don't believe you do. There's money inside. Not all your fare, but what I could put together." A short laugh came from somewhere near the courthouse rail. Pearl did not turn toward it. She opened the envelope. Several folded bills rested behind Edward's letter. Coins shifted at the bottom. She removed the page. His handwriting was familiar. She had read it by lamplight for almost 8 months. "Dear Pearl." She stopped there. The wind lifted the corner of the paper. Edward said, "You don't have to read it here." Pearl looked at him. "Did you know this before I boarded that coach?" He said nothing. Pearl waited. Edward's eyes dropped to his hat. That was answer enough. She looked back at the page. Something in her hand trembled. Not much. Just enough to make the paper rustle. She folded it once. The edges didn't meet. Pearl opened it again. This time she lined the corners carefully and folded it straight. Then she put the letter back inside the envelope. The coins gave a small metallic click. Edward flinched at the sound. "I'm sorry," he said again. Pearl slipped the envelope into her coat. "You've said that." She picked up her valise. "Pearl." She stopped but did not turn. "There are things you don't understand. Then you had 5 days while I was sitting in that coach to decide whether I deserved to understand them." Edward had no answer. Pearl walked away. Only then did she hear one of the men near the livery say, "Mills probably saved himself some trouble." Another man gave a low chuckle. Across the street, John Grady had been tying a canvas sack of horseshoes behind his saddle. He straightened. At 39, John was accustomed to people noticing when he did that. He stood a little over 6.5 feet, built heavily through the shoulders from years of lifting feed sacks, stretching wire, handling cattle, and doing the 1,000 ordinary jobs that made a ranch survive. Most men in Dry Creek called him Big Grady, not always to his face. The young ranch hand who had spoken saw John looking at him. John didn't threaten him, didn't step toward him, didn't say a word. He simply held the man's gaze. The chuckling stopped. John bent again and tightened the saddle strap. Pearl saw none of it. She had already reached the station. The agent came outside when he saw her. "Everything all right, Miss Ramsey?" "No." The honesty seemed to catch him off guard. Pearl looked at her trunk. "Is there a boarding house?" "Ellison's. 2 doors past the dining room. Clean place, thank you." He hesitated. "Mills coming for your trunk later?" Pearl looked back toward the courthouse. Edward was gone. "No," she said. "He isn't." She lifted one end of the trunk. It was heavier than she remembered. Before the station agent could reach for it, a shadow crossed the platform. Pearl looked up. The man from across the street stood a few feet away. Up close, John Grady was even taller than she had thought. His coat was plain brown wool, worn white along one cuff. A faded scar crossed two knuckles on his right hand. He carried no expression she could easily read. His eyes went to the trunk, then to Pearl. "Mom." Pearl straightened. She had heard the name Grady twice during the journey into town. Once from a cattle buyer, once from the driver. Neither story had been especially friendly. "I'm managing," she said. John's gaze rested on her for a moment. Then he nodded. "All right." That was all. He stepped aside. The station agent helped Pearl lift the other end, and together they carried the trunk down the boardwalk. Pearl glanced back once. John was already returning to his horse. He had offered nothing, insisted on nothing. For some reason, she remembered that. Martha Ellison's boarding house had 6 rooms upstairs and a dining room that smelled of onions, coffee, and fresh bread. Martha herself was broad through the shoulders, silver showing at both temples. Her sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold. She looked at Pearl, then at the trunk, then at the street behind her. Edward Mills didn't come. It wasn't a question. Pearl took off one glove. He came. Martha understood the difference. Her mouth tightened. "I've got a room at 75 cents a night. Supper's 25 if you want it. I'll take the room." "How many nights?" Pearl opened her purse. The money inside suddenly looked much smaller than it had in Missouri. 3 to begin with. Martha took the coins without comment. "Top of the stairs, second door, wash basins filled. Supper at 6. Pearl lifted her valise. Martha caught the trunk handle. "This stays down here until my nephew gets back." Pearl started to object. Martha gave her a level look. "I said my nephew, not you." For the first time that day, something almost like amusement touched Pearl's face. "All right, upstairs." The room was narrow but clean. Iron bed, patchwork quilt, washstand, one straight-back chair beside a window overlooking the street. Pearl closed the door, then she stood with her back against it. No audience now. No Edward, no ranch hands, no women watching from the general store. She removed her bonnet and set it carefully on the bed. Her hairpins had pulled loose during the journey. She took them out one by one and laid them beside the wash basin. Only after that did she remove Edward's envelope. She sat by the window. Outside, Dry Creek Junction was turning blue with evening. Lanterns appeared behind stores' windows. A man led 2 horses toward the livery. Somewhere a hammer rang 3 times against an anvil. Pearl unfolded the letter. She read all of it. Edward wrote that circumstances had changed, that the ranch was in difficulty, that marrying now would make matters worse, that Pearl should use the enclosed money to return east. He hoped she would someday forgive him. Pearl reached the last lines. Her eyes stopped. She read them again. "Whatever else happens, don't mention Ramsey Crossing to Sloan." Pearl leaned closer to the lamp. Ramsey Crossing. She had never heard the words before. Sloan meant nothing to her either, but Ramsey did. Her father, Isaiah Ramsey, had spent years moving between Missouri horse yards and western buying stations before settling in St. Joseph. He had kept nearly every scrap of paper he'd ever been handed. Freight receipts, feed accounts, sale bills, brand sketches, notes written on the backs of advertisements. After his death, Pearl had sorted them into a tin box. She had brought that box west because among those papers were the few documents connected to the money and property interests he had left her. Pearl crossed the room. She knelt beside her valise and lifted out the dark tin box. The latch stuck. It always did in cold weather. She pressed her thumb against it until it snapped open. The smell of old paper rose faintly from inside. She spread the contents across the bed. A receipt from a St. Joseph feed merchant, a horse sale tally, 2 promissory notes already paid, a folded letter from her father that she did not open, then a yellowed sheet with a freight company's name printed across the top. Pearl had seen it many times. She had always taken it for an old invoice. Tonight she noticed something different. There were measurements written along one margin. Numbers. A creek notation. A mark that looked like a boundary line. Pearl carried it to the lamp. At the bottom, half hidden beneath an old fold, 2 words had been written in her father's hand. Ramsey Crossing. Pearl stood very still. Down in the street, a horse went past at a slow walk. She moved to the window. The rider was the tall man from the station, John Grady. He rode beneath the boarding house lamp without looking up, then disappeared toward the dark western end of town. Pearl lowered her eyes to the paper again. Edward had known about this. Someone named Sloan knew about it, and her father had known about it long before either of them. Pearl pulled the chair to the table. She flattened the old paper beneath both palms. She had come to Dry Creek Junction, expecting to become Edward Mills's wife. Before sundown, that future had disappeared. But there was something else waiting for her here, something her father had never explained. And Pearl Ramsey had no intention of boarding another stagecoach until she knew what it was. By 7 the next morning, snow had not fallen, but the puddles behind Martha Ellison's boarding house carried a skin of ice. Pearl came downstairs dressed before breakfast, the old Ramsey paper folded inside her coat. Martha was behind the dining room counter with a pencil tucked above one ear. 3 teamsters ate eggs near the stove. Coffee steamed in thick white cups, and somewhere in the kitchen, bacon snapped in an iron skillet. Pearl had slept little. She had spent half the night comparing her father's paper with Edward's warning, but the numbers meant nothing without knowing the land. Martha set down a plate. "You look like you argued with your pillow." The pillow lost. Martha almost smiled. Then Pearl noticed the account book beside the coffee pot. 3 freight receipts had been pinned to one page. She looked once, then again. "Martha, did you order flour 3 times last month?" "Twice." Pearl pulled the ledger closer. The same wagon number appeared on 3 receipts. 2 dates differed, but the weight and driver's mark were identical. "You paid for the October 12th shipment twice." Martha wiped her hands on her apron and leaned over. "I most certainly did not." "You did if this book is right." Pearl showed her the figures. Martha stared at them for several seconds, then muttered something under her breath about freight clerks. Pearl turned another page. "There's another duplicate here." Martha sat down. "How long would it take you to straighten this mess?" Pearl looked at the ledger, then at the purse in her lap. 2 evenings, maybe 3, Martha folded her arms. "I've got a proposition. You fix my books, I'll give you a room and supper through next Thursday." Pearl considered it. "No breakfast?" "Coffee, breakfast." Martha narrowed her eyes. Pearl waited. "Fine," Martha said. "Breakfast." Pearl held out her hand. Martha shook it. That was how Pearl bought herself a week in Dry Creek Junction without spending another dollar. An hour later, she crossed the frozen street toward Doyle's livery. The smithy doors stood open despite the cold. Sparks jumped from Patrick Doyle's forge as he worked a shoe over the anvil. He was a thick-bodied man with gray in his beard and leather apron polished dark from years of use. Pearl waited until he quenched the iron. "Mr. Doyle?" He looked up. Patrick Doyle. Pearl Ramsey. The hammer stopped halfway to its hook. "Ramsey?" Pearl took the paper from her coat. "My father's name was Isaiah Ramsey." Patrick wiped his hands before touching it. The moment he saw the signature, his face changed. "I'll be damned. You knew him?" "Knew of him first. Knew him later." Patrick carried the paper toward the doorway for better light. Isaiah worked with a horse buyer named Mercer for a season, 11, maybe 12 years back. They kept a station west of Cottonwood Gap. Your father could judge a horse's feet before most men finished looking at its teeth. Pearl watched him trace one finger near the faded measurements. What was Ramsey Crossing? Patrick's finger stopped. Before he could answer, boots sounded behind them. Morning, Doyle. Patrick folded the paper halfway without thinking. The man entering the livery wore a charcoal coat with a fur collar and gloves too clean for forge work. His mustache was trimmed close. He looked first at Patrick, then Pearl, then the paper. Only for an instant. But Pearl saw it. Mr. Sloan, Patrick said. So this was Sloan. Victor Sloan removed one glove. You must be Miss Ramsey. Pearl did not ask how he knew. Mr. Sloan, I heard about yesterday. Unfortunate business. Pearl said nothing. His eyes returned to the paper. Family documents? Something like that. Sloan smiled mildly. Dry Creek has accumulated more worthless land papers than it has good land. Men drew lines wherever they pleased 20 years ago. Then I suppose there's no reason for anyone to be interested in mine. The smile stayed. Quite right. Patrick handed the paper back to Pearl. Sloan buttoned his glove. Still, if you're returning east, I'd be willing to save you the trouble of sorting through old claims. Say $50 for the lot. Patrick looked sharply at him. $50 was no casual offer. Pearl folded the paper. You just told me they're worthless. Sentimental value can complicate business. I've worked around horse traders, Mr. Sloan. A small silence settled over the livery. Pearl slipped the document inside her coat. I never sell anything before I know why the buyer wants it. Sloan studied her differently after that. Fair enough. He tipped his hat. Good morning, Miss Ramsey. When he left, Patrick waited until Sloan's footsteps disappeared. Don't give that man anything. I wasn't planning to. Patrick looked toward the street. Ramsey Crossing was an old wagon crossing. Creek runs through Cottonwood Gap. Good water most years. Trail connects several northern spreads to the depot road. Who owns it? That's the question. A horse snorted from one of the stalls. Pearl turned. John Grady stood beside a bay mare, checking a foreleg. She had not heard him enter. He must have been there before Sloan. Mr. Grady, Miss Ramsey. Patrick gave John a look. She wants to know about Cottonwood Gap. John straightened. The mare beside him jerked at the sudden crack of Patrick's hammer. Pearl expected John to catch the halter hard. Instead, he loosened his hand. He lowered one shoulder, turned partly sideways, and waited. The mare's nostrils worked. John held out his palm. After a few seconds, she stretched her neck and touched it. Only then did he rub the white mark above her nose. Pearl remembered what people had said about Big Grady. Nothing about the man beside the mare matched the stories. Ramsey Crossing, Pearl said. John's eyes came back to her. West of town, near High Basin's south boundary. How do I get there? North Trail is iced over in places. I asked how to get there. John looked at her for a long moment. Pearl braced herself for an argument. None came. He took a feed invoice from Patrick's desk and picked up a broken piece of charcoal. Main road west for 4 miles. He drew a line. At the split, North Trail is shorter. South Road adds 3 miles, another line. This section by the creek turns to mud under the ice. Keep uphill of the cottonwoods. Pearl looked down at the crude map. That's all? You asked for the road. Something in her expression softened before she could stop it. Thank you. John handed her the invoice. Their fingers did not quite touch. Don't ride it after dark. Pearl lifted one eyebrow. John added, That's information, not an order. Patrick coughed into his fist to hide a laugh. Pearl folded the map. I'll keep the distinction in mind. By early afternoon, she had rented a steady sorrel mare from Patrick and ridden east instead of west. Edward Mills's ranch sat 5 miles outside town, behind a weathered gate hanging crooked from one hinge. Edward was repairing fence when Pearl arrived. He saw her and stopped driving the staple. "You shouldn't have come." Pearl dismounted. "You've already made one decision for me this week." Edward set down the hammer. "What do you want?" "The truth." He looked toward the house. Pearl took out Edward's letter. "Who is Victor Sloan?" Edward's shoulders sagged. "A man I owe money. How much? More than I can pay before spring. Did he tell you not to marry me?" Edward stared at the ground. Pearl waited. Finally, he said, "Sloan bought my promissory note from the bank." "When?" "3 weeks ago. And he offered to hold off foreclosure if I signed him first, right on the wagon lane across my west pasture." Pearl's voice stayed level and broke our engagement. Edward looked at her then. "Yes." The wind moved dry weeds against the fence. Pearl's gloved hand closed around the folded letter. "You let me travel 5 days knowing this. I thought I could fix it. Until when?" He had no answer. Pearl stepped closer. Why did my marriage matter to him? Edward looked toward the western horizon. Cottonwood Gap was somewhere beyond it. "Edward." He rubbed both hands over his face. "Because Sloan's been trying to tie up every usable route between the northern ranches and the railroad before winter. Mill's land gives him one side, High Basin blocks another." Pearl's breathing slowed. "And me?" Edward looked sick. "Your father's land sits between mine and Grady's." The words hung between them. Pearl stared at him. "My father owned land here? I don't know exactly what he owned. Sloan knows more than I do. How did Sloan know I was coming?" Edward's silence answered that too. Pearl put one boot in the stirrup. "Pearl, wait," she mounted. "I didn't do this because of how you look, or because I changed my mind about you." She looked down at him. "That does not improve what you did." Edward lowered his eyes. Pearl turned the mare toward Dry Creek. The ride back took nearly an hour. The sky had darkened by the time she reached Doyle's livery. Patrick was waiting inside. So was John. An old leather-bound ledger lay open on a barrel between them. Patrick tapped one yellowed page, found this behind the brand register. Pearl stepped closer. The entry was dated 14 years earlier. Isaiah Ramsey. Below it were notes about 3 horses, feed charges, and a north boundary measurement. Then Pearl saw the final line. North line measured with J. Grady. She read it twice, then looked at John. "Did you know my father?" "No, but that's your name." John leaned closer to the ledger. For the first time since Pearl had met him, his calm expression broke. "Not much, just enough." He touched the faded initials. "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." Pearl waited. John's eyes stayed on the page. "My father's name was Joseph Grady." Pearl looked from him to the faded ledger. Patrick leaned one hip against the barrel. "Joseph kept records about as well as a mule keeps appointments," he said. "If he wrote down a measurement, it mattered." John ran his thumb once along the edge of the page. "He died 9 years ago. Did he ever mention my father?" Pearl asked. "A horseman named Ramsey. Once or twice, that seems worth remembering." John looked at her. "I was 25 and more interested in getting cattle through spring mud than in old boundary talk." Pearl accepted that, without liking it. Patrick turned the ledger toward the light. "North line measured with J. Grady." "Doesn't say why. It gives us somewhere to start," Pearl said. John nodded toward the window. "Snow will cover most stone markers if it comes hard." "When?" 2 days, maybe 3. Pearl folded her arms. "Then we go tomorrow." Patrick looked between them. John said, "We?" Pearl's expression did not change. "You know the country. I know the papers." John considered that. "I can take you." "No." His brow moved slightly. Pearl reached into her satchel and took out the crude charcoal map he had drawn for her. I don't want another favor. I didn't call it one. I am John rested both hands on the barrel. All right, Pearl continued. You give me the horse and your knowledge of Cottonwood Gap. I look through your freight accounts. Patrick let out a low whistle. John's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but interest. What makes you think I need that? Because Sloan offered $50 for paper he called worthless. Men like that rarely make only one kind of mistake. John said nothing, Pearl went on. And because yesterday at the livery, you had 3 different freight tags tied to the same hay supplier's sacks. Pat looked impressed. John looked almost amused. You're observant. I was paid to be. He held her gaze another second. High Basin, 6 o'clock, 6:30. Daylight's short, so is patience. Patrick barked a laugh. John picked up his gloves. 6:15. Pearl gave him one small nod. Done. High Basin Ranch sat northwest of Dry Creek Junction, where the open grassland began lifting toward darker country. Pearl reached it the next morning under a sky the color of tin. The ranch house was plain and long, built against the wind. A bunkhouse stood beyond the corrals. Smoke rose from a cook stove pipe. Men were already moving cattle near a frost-silvered fence line. John waited beside 2 saddled horses. He had chosen a compact buckskin mare for Pearl. Her name's June. Pearl checked the girth herself. John watched without interfering. You always inspect somebody else's tack? Always. Good. That was all he said. Before they left, John led her into a small office off the ranch kitchen. 3 years of ledgers sat stacked on a desk. Pearl stared at them. You weren't exaggerating. I rarely do. She pulled off her gloves and opened the newest book. Freight receipts had been pinned between pages. Hay weights, rail charges, delivery fees. Pearl traced a column with one finger. Who checks these? I do. And before you, my foreman. Anyone compare them against original contracts? John leaned against the doorframe. Apparently not well enough. Pearl looked up. Leave me an hour. 2, I thought we were riding. We are. Then 1, John pushed himself away from the frame. Unshawan. By the time the clock on the kitchen shelf struck 7:30, Pearl had found the first problem. By 8, she had found 4 more. She laid 3 receipts side by side, these winter handling charges. Were they in your agreement? No. Did you authorize them later? No. She tapped the figures. And these hay weights don't match your receiving tallies. John stepped closer. Pearl pointed to the pencil notations in the margin. Your men recorded 8,600 pounds. Sloan billed 92. John's jaw tightened. How many loads? At least 7. He looked at the ledger in silence. Pearl closed it. That's enough for now. John did not praise her. He simply gathered the receipts and placed them neatly beside her elbow. Then he brought over 2 older ledgers and set them on the table. Pearl looked at the stack. 3 years? If you're going to find a pattern, you might as well find the whole one. She looked up at him. That was the first moment she understood how John Grady showed trust, not with compliments, with access. They rode west an hour later. The wind had sharpened. June picked her way steadily over frozen ruts, while John's taller bay moved ahead at an easy walk. Cottonwood Gap narrowed slowly around them. The high grass gave way to low brush and scattered trees. The creek flashed between thin shelves of ice. John rode ahead, then stopped, then rode ahead again. Pearl finally said, You keep doing that. He looked back. Doing what? Checking every stretch of ground before I get there. Creek banks soft. I can see mud, not under ice. Pearl tightened her reins. If you're worried I can't ride this country, say so. John turned his horse fully. Last week a steer broke through an ice shelf there. He pointed to a darker strip near the creek, lost the use of one leg for 2 days. Pearl looked. The ice appeared solid from where she sat. John waited. she exhaled. That would have been useful information 5 minutes ago. I thought it was obvious what I was checking. To you. He looked at the creek, then back at her. Fair. Pearl blinked. She had expected an argument. Instead, John said, I'll tell you next time. They moved on. The admission did something small and inconvenient inside her. By noon, they reached a stand of cottonwoods bent east by years of wind. John dismounted. There, a square stone protruded from the frozen ground, half buried in dead grass. Pearl knelt beside it. A shallow mark had been cut into the face. She took out her father's paper. The measurements matched the creek bend almost exactly. One marker, she said. There should be another north of here. They searched for more than an hour. Nothing. John dug through old leaves with the heel of his boot. Pearl followed a line drawn faintly on Isaiah's paper toward a ruined shed farther uphill. The building had once been used by line riders. One wall leaned inward, the door hung crooked. Inside lay a broken stool, 2 rusted nails, and a length of rotten harness leather. Pearl ran her hand over the doorframe, then stopped. What? John came closer. A narrow strip of wood had been nailed over an old split in the frame. It was not the same pine as the rest. Packing crate wood. Pearl rubbed away dirt with her glove. Pencil marks appeared. Numbers. Faint. Nearly gone. She pulled out her father's paper. 24 chains. Creek bend, north line. John stood behind her shoulder, reading over it. Same measurements, close enough to matter. He looked toward the missing wall. Second stone may have been moved. Pearl turned. Moved by weather, John did not answer, which was answer enough. They rode back to town with the light already thinning. The general store was crowded. Pearl knew something was wrong before she reached the door. Too many horses tied outside. Too many men standing with nowhere to go. Victor Sloan was inside beside the counter. Bert Crane stood near the stove holding a county map. Patrick Doyle had his arms crossed. Several ranchers turned when Pearl entered. Sloan smiled. There she is. Pearl removed one glove. What is this? A misunderstanding I'm trying to prevent. By gathering an audience? Sloan shrugged. Land matters concern neighbors. One rancher near the flour barrels said, Herd Mills' rejected bride is claiming half the gap now. A few men shifted uncomfortably. Pearl looked at the speaker. Then you heard wrong. Sloan stepped in smoothly. Miss Ramsey has old family papers, nothing more. No deed anyone has yet seen. No recorded boundary anyone can rely upon. Pearl took the freight receipts from her satchel. And you have charges no customer authorized. The room changed. Sloan's expression hardened. That is a separate matter. No, it tells me how you do business. John entered behind Pearl. Conversation dropped almost at once. He had to duck slightly beneath the doorframe. One man near the stove moved his chair aside without being asked. Sloan turned toward him. Grady, perhaps you can explain to Miss Ramsey that these things are more complicated than keeping a boarding house ledger. John's face became very still. Pearl saw it then, the thing people mistook for menace, not anger, control. Sloan continued. Your ranch stands to lose more than anyone if she keeps stirring up old claims. John looked at Pearl. She had 3 receipts in her hand. Then he looked at Sloan. Miss Ramsey asked who authorized the charge. Sloan frowned. What? Answer her. Grady, this is between men who actually operate ranches. John did not move closer. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he pulled a chair away from the wall and set it beside the counter. Then he stepped back. Pearl looked at the chair, then at him. John said nothing. The room was hers if she wanted it. Pearl sat. She laid the first receipt flat. October 3rd. High Basin received 8,600 pounds of hay. Second receipt, October 10th. Same supplier, same rate 3rd, October 17th. Winter handling charge appears for the first time. Sloan shifted. Pearl looked at Albert Crane. Do you see any amendment signed by Mr. Grady? Albert bent closer. No. Any later contract? No. Pearl slid another paper forward. Then who authorized it? No one laughed now. Sloan looked at John again. John's arms remained loose at his sides. He gave Sloan nothing. Sonorly, Sloan said, "It was an office adjustment. Authorized by whom?" Sloan's mouth tightened. "My clerk. Then your clerk changed a contract without the customer's signature." Silence. Patrick's anvil rang once from the open smithy next door, sharp in the cold air. Sloan gathered the receipts. "I'll review it." Pearl held one corner. Their copies. For the first time, a rancher near the stove smiled. Not at her, with her. Sloan released the papers. Albert Crane cleared his throat. "If we're finished with freight charges, there's something else." He opened the county map across the counter. Pearl stood. John moved closer. Albert pointed to Cottonwood Gap. "Old survey notation here. Ramsey Line appears to include the creek crossing." Pearl leaned over the map. John said nothing. Albert continued. "If those measurements you found match this notation, Miss Ramsey may have a legitimate claim to the crossing parcel." One of the ranchers whistled softly. Pearl looked at John. "What does that mean for High Basin?" Albert hesitated. John answered. "We've moved cattle through that crossing since before I owned the ranch." "How long?" "Nearly 20 years." Pearl stared at him. The room suddenly felt smaller. The land that might belong to her was the same land John needed. Sloan watched both of them. Pearl saw the calculation return to his face. There it was, the wedge. John studied the map. Then he straightened. "Until we know whose land it is, I won't move another herd across it." A rancher near the stove said, "John, you've got a shipment due before the next storm." "I know. You'll lose days taking the South Trail." "I know." Pearl looked at him. He could have argued possession. He could have called 20 years of use enough. He could have told her this was ranch business she did not understand. Instead, he had just put his own winter shipment at risk rather than use land that might be hers without permission. John met her eyes. No speech, no promise. Just the decision. Outside, the wind pushed dry snow grains against the windows. Pearl looked down at the county map. The line between Ramsey Land and High Basin Ranch was only a stroke of faded ink. But from that moment on, it belonged to both their futures. The snow came 2 mornings later, not a storm at first, just a thin white sheet over the pasture, enough to hide wagon ruts and turn every fence rail silver. By noon, the north road through Cottonwood Gap had hardened under ice. John kept his word. No High Basin cattle crossed Ramsey Land. That decision cost him almost at once. The ranch had one last winter shipment to move before the rail depot reduced its schedule, and the South Trail added hours to every wagon run. Hay had to be hauled farther. Teams wore down faster. Men came in after dark with frost on their collars and mud frozen stiff around their boots. Pearl saw all of it. She had moved temporarily into High Basin's spare room so she could finish the freight accounts before Albert Crane called the county hearing. Lou Grady, John's widowed aunt, ran the house with quiet authority and made it clear to everyone that Pearl was there as a working guest, not as an object for gossip. Lou was 65, sharp-eyed, and unimpressed by nearly everybody. On Pearl's first morning, she set a stack of clean towels on the bed and said, "John forgets meals when weather turns bad." Pearl looked up from the ledger. "Is that a warning?" "It's an observation. I don't intend to mother him." Lou's mouth twitched. Good. He'd hate that. The days settled into a strange rhythm. Pearl worked at the long table near the kitchen stove. John came and went with cold in his coat and dust or snow on his boots. Sometimes he spoke, often he did not. But he began leaving things where Pearl could find them. A bundle of older freight receipts, a tally from the North herd, a note naming which driver had signed which delivery. Once, after Pearl complained that the lamp smoked, she came back from supper and found the wick trimmed and the chimney cleaned. John never mentioned it. One evening, she fell asleep with her cheek near an open ledger. When she woke, the room was nearly dark, the lamp had been turned low. A folded blanket rested over the back of her chair. John's gloves were gone from the peg by the door. Pearl touched the blanket once and then went back to work. The next night, John came in after 10. He removed his coat, crossed to the stove and poured coffee. Then he took down a second cup. He set it on the table without looking. Only after that did he stop. Pearl watched him. John looked at the cup, then at her. Neither said anything. Pearl reached out and pulled it toward herself. John sat across from her. For several minutes, the only sounds were the stove ticking and sleet tapping lightly against the window. It was the closest they had come to saying anything that mattered. The next morning, the south trail turned dangerous. A layer of ice had formed over the creek bank before sunrise. One of High Basin's hay wagons started down the slope shortly after 9. Pearl was in the office checking weight slips when shouting broke out near the corrals. She pushed back from the table and ran outside. The wagon had gone sideways near the creek. One rear wheel had slid off the packed trail. The team was struggling against the harness, hooves slipping on frozen ground. John was already moving downhill. "Hold the lead horse!" he shouted. 2 ranch hands grabbed for the bridles. The wagon shifted. John reached the traces and started freeing the near horse. Then the downhill wheel dropped another foot. Everything changed at once. One horse went to its knees. The wagon swung. John tried to clear the tongue, but the side of the wagon caught him and threw him hard against the rocky bank. The men froze. "John!" Pearl was already running. He was conscious. That mattered first. He pushed one hand against the ground and tried to stand. His right arm hung wrong. His left knee buckled the moment he put weight on it. "I'm fine." Pearl looked at him once. "No, you're not." The horses were still fighting the harness. The wagon creaked. One ranch hand looked at John. "What do we do?" John tried to get up again. Pearl stepped between him and the slope. "Don't!" His eyes sharpened. "Pearl!" She pointed to a folded saddle blanket near the fence. "Sit." For 1 second, nobody moved. Big Grady did not take orders from anyone, not in front of his men, not on his own ranch. Pearl did not raise her voice. "You trusted me with your books. Trust me with your horses." John stared at her. Then slowly, he sat. The ranch hands looked more shocked by that than by the accident. Pearl turned toward the team. "Cover the near horse's eyes." One man hesitated. "Do it." She moved closer, keeping out of the kick range. The near horse was breathing fast and pulling against the bit. Pearl took off her scarf and handed it over. "Loose, don't tie it tight." The cloth went over the horse's eyes. Its head lowered slightly. "Now cut that trace." The younger hand looked at the harness. "That'll ruin it. It'll save the horse." He cut it. The tension shifted. Pearl had the men unload part of the hay from the downhill side, one bale at a time. Then they brought a second team from the corral and hitched a rope to the wagon frame. "Slow," Pearl said. "No jerking." John watched from the blanket, pale around the mouth. The wagon moved 6 inches, stopped, moved again. One wheel climbed back toward the trail. The horses steadied. A few minutes later, the wagon was clear. No one cheered. They were too cold and too tired for that. But one of the hands looked at Pearl differently, like she had become part of the ranch without anybody noticing when it happened. Only after the team was safe did Pearl turn back to John. He was standing again. "Barely. Sit down. I've already done that once today. Then you're practiced." One of the men coughed to hide a laugh. John gave him a look. The laugh disappeared. Pearl walked over. "Can you move your fingers?" He did. "Good. My shoulder's out, I can see that. And my knee's not broken. How do you know? Because I know. Pearl looked at him. John sighed. Because I can put weight on it. Poorly. That earned the faintest change in his expression. Almost a smile. Lou sent for the nearest doctor, but by the time he arrived, the worst of the daylight was gone. John's shoulder was set back in place and his knee wrapped tightly. The doctor ordered him off a horse for several days. John listened with the expression of a man hearing a bad joke. Pearl returned to the Ledgers that evening. She did not sit beside John's bed, did not bring him broth every hour. Lou handled the medicine and made sure he rested. Pearl simply continued doing the work that needed doing. That changed something more than fussing ever could have. On the third day, John came into the kitchen with a cane he clearly disliked. Pearl was checking freight routes. He stopped beside the table. "What do you think of moving the next load through the East Ridge?" Pearl looked up. 2 weeks earlier, he would have told her what he planned. Now he was asking. She moved one receipt aside. "Too steep if the wagon is full, half load, maybe. But you'd spend more in extra trips than you'd save in time," John nodded. "What would you do?" Pearl pointed to the map. "Wait one day. Let the south trail thaw at noon, move the first wagon light, then send the heavier load behind it after the ruts open." John studied the route. "That's what I was thinking." "Then why ask?" He leaned one hand on the chair. "Because sometimes you see what I don't." Pearl did not answer right away. Neither did he. The room grew quiet. She finally said, "I want to build a horse yard." John looked at her. "Here? If Ramsey Crossing is mine." She turned the pencil between her fingers. "Training horses for smaller ranches. Teams too, if I can get enough space. You've thought about this a while." "Years. Did Mills know?" Pearl gave a short laugh with no humor in it. "He knew I worked around horses." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. "No." John waited. Pearl said, "He always told me I wouldn't need to work after we married." John's jaw shifted once. "What did you tell him?" "That he misunderstood what I meant by need." John looked down at the map. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then, very quietly, "Ramsey Horse Yard." Pearl looked at him. "That's what I'd call it. It sounds right." Their eyes met. The silence between them was different now. Warmer. More dangerous. Pearl felt it and looked back at the ledger first. John did not move. For a moment it seemed he might say something. Then hoofbeats sounded outside. Fast, too fast for that hour. Lou opened the front door. Cold air rushed through the hall. Edward Mills stood on the porch with snow on his shoulders and a leather pouch in his hand. "I need to speak to Pearl." John straightened. His cane struck the floor once. Pearl stood. Ed looked from one of them to the other. Then he stepped inside. His face looked worse than it had the day he ended the engagement. "I brought something." He opened the pouch and removed a narrow ledger stub. Victor Sloan's signature crossed the bottom. Pearl took it. "What is this?" Edward swallowed. "The thing I should have shown you before you ever left Missouri." John's expression went still. Edward looked at Pearl. "Sloan knew about your father's agreement before you came." Pearl said nothing. "If you married me, your interest in Ramsey land and my wagon lane would sit together." He looked down. That would have blocked him from controlling the whole gap. Pearl's fingers tightened around the paper. "So he bought your note?" "Yes, and you agreed to end the marriage." Edward nodded. "I signed away my option on the West Lane. He promised he'd hold off foreclosure." Pearl's voice was quiet. "Promised." Edward laughed once bitterly. "He's taking the ranch anyway." The room went still. Lou stood near the doorway. John said nothing. Edward looked directly at Pearl now. "I sold you out." Pearl's face did not change, and he still took everything. He pointed to a number written on the ledger stub. That's a county filing number. Sloan made me copy it when we signed. Pearl turned the paper toward John. John looked at the number. Crane. Pearl nodded. They rode into Dry Creek the next morning. John did not ride. He took the buckboard because of his knee. Albert Crane met them in the record room behind the courthouse. The room smelled of dust, ink, and cold paper. He found the old filing book after nearly half an hour. Then he stopped. One page had been crossed through in red pencil years earlier. Pearl leaned closer. At the bottom sat a signature, Joseph Grady, John's father. John stared at it. Pearl looked at him. For the first time since they had begun searching, neither one knew whether the next piece of truth would bring them closer together or put them on opposite sides of the same land. Albert Crane adjusted his spectacles and ran one finger beneath the red line on the page. This filing was entered 17 years ago, he said, then marked against the following spring. Marked against by whom? Pearl asked. Albert turned the book slightly. No clerk's initials. John leaned on his cane beside the table. His injured shoulder was still bound beneath his coat, though he had refused the sling that morning. Can it still be used? Not by itself. Pearl looked at the signature again. Joseph Grady. Albert closed the book carefully. We'll need the supporting papers, any copies, any witness who can explain the original boundary. When? Pearl asked. Day after tomorrow, 10 in the morning. John looked at her. That gives us 1 day. Pearl folded Edward's ledger stub and put it inside her document case. Then we use it. The county hearing was held in the record room behind the courthouse. There was no judge's bench, no jury box, only Albert Crane's long desk, 2 wooden tables, a coal stove, shelves of deed books, and too many men for the size of the room. Victor Sloan arrived first. He wore the same charcoal coat he had worn at Doyle's livery, but this time he brought 2 folders under one arm and a rancher who had freight business with him. Edward Mills came alone. Patrick Doyle stood near the wall with his hat in both hands. 3 affected landholders waited near the stove. John stayed beside the back table. Pearl stood at the front with her father's papers arranged in order. Isaiah Ramsey's old sheet, the line shed measurements, a copy of the remaining survey mark, High Basin freight receipts, Edward's option agreement, the ledger stub. Albert looked around the room. This isn't a trial. We're determining what the county record supports regarding Ramsey Crossing and any attached rites of passage. Sloan smiled faintly. Should take 5 minutes. Pearl looked at him. Then you won't be inconvenienced. Patrick coughed into his hand. John lowered his eyes, but Pearl saw the corner of his mouth move. Albert began with the oldest papers. Pearl explained what she had found without embellishment. She showed how Isaiah's measurements followed the creek bend. Patrick confirmed that Isaiah Ramsey had worked west of Cottonwood Gap, and that Joseph Grady had surveyed with him. Edward produced the agreement Sloan had made him sign. Then Pearl laid out the altered freight charges. Sloan's expression tightened. Those billing errors have nothing to do with ownership. No, Pearl said. But your willingness to buy my father's papers, after calling them worthless, does. Sloan turned toward Albert. Miss Ramsey is confusing suspicion with title. Albert nodded once. That part is true. Suspicion doesn't establish ownership. Pearl has accepted it. She reached for the next paper. Sloan interrupted. There's a simpler solution. The room went quiet. He looked toward John. If Miss Ramsey insists on pressing this claim, High Basin could lose unrestricted use of the crossing. John said nothing. Sloan continued. Grady's cattle have used that road for nearly 20 years. His ranch depends on it. Pearl watched John. Sloan took a step closer to her table. On the other hand, if Miss Ramsey assigns any interest she has to High Basin, then Grady's position strengthens considerably. The 2 claims stop fighting each other. There it was, the choice he wanted everyone to see. Pearl versus John, her future versus his ranch. Sloan looked at John again. You know I'm right. John's face went still. Pearl remembered the first day outside the courthouse. The laughter, the envelope, the feeling of every eye deciding what kind of woman she must be before she said a word. Now the room was waiting again, waiting for John to speak for her. He did not. Instead, he reached inside his coat. I found something. Pearl looked at him. John placed a folded sheet on Albert Crane's desk. The paper was old enough to have gone soft along the creases. Albert opened it. His eyes moved slowly across the page. Then he looked up. Where did this come from? My father's ranch box. When did you find it? 3 nights ago. Pearl's breath caught. 3 nights. John had known before the hearing. Albert read aloud only enough for the room to understand. Joseph Grady acknowledged that Isaiah Ramsey retained control of the crossing parcel. High Basin's use was described as seasonal passage by permission. Not ownership, not permanent right. Permission. Sloan's face changed first. Edward looked down. Patrick closed his eyes for half a second. Pearl looked only at John. If he had kept the paper hidden, High Basin could have argued long use. If the county never found another copy, Pearl's claim would have been harder to prove. John had held the one document that could weaken his own ranch and strengthen hers, and he had brought it into the room himself. Sloan's voice turned sharp. That isn't even signed by Ramsey. No, John said, but it is in your father's hand. Yes, and you're volunteering it? John met his gaze. Yes, why? John's answer came without heat, because it's the truth. The room went quiet. Sloan laughed once. Truth doesn't feed cattle. No, John looked at Pearl, but stealing somebody else's ground won't either. Pearl did not move. There was too much she could have said. None of it belonged in that room. Bert spent nearly an hour comparing dates, handwriting, filings, and survey notes. At last he closed the county book. The Ramsey parcel is supported. Pearl's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Albert continued. Ramsey Crossing belongs with that parcel. High Basin's historic use appears seasonal and permissive, not possessory. One of the ranchers near the stove let out a breath. Sloan spoke. And my freight, right? Albert looked at Edward's signed agreement. The mill's option does not give you control over Ramsey land, nor does it establish exclusive passage through the gap. Sloan's jaw hardened. So that's your decision? That's what the record supports. For the first time since Pearl had arrived in Dry Creek Junction, Victor Sloan had nothing left to offer her. No money, no warning, no polite dismissal. He gathered his folders and left. The door shut behind him. Edward remained near the wall. Pearl looked at him. I'm sorry, he said. She believed him this time. That did not change anything. I know, Edward swallowed. I don't expect you to forgive what I did. Pearl slid her father's paper back into its case. I can understand why you were afraid, and still decide I won't build my life on it. Edward nodded. That was enough. Outside the courthouse, John stood near the hitching rail while Pearl spoke with Albert. When she finished, she came to him, carrying a fresh sheet of paper. John looked at it. What's that? A contract. His brow rose. Pearl handed it over. High Basin would receive seasonal passage through Ramsey Crossing. The fee was small. In return, High Basin would provide 2 suitable horses and a limited number of ranch hands in spring to help set posts and build corrals for Ramsey Horse Yard. John read every line. Pearl watched him reach the bottom. You could have just given me passage. I could have. You didn't. No, John looked at her. Good. He took Albert's pen, then signed. The work began changing almost immediately. Not all at once. Nothing in ranch country happened that way, but within a week, High Basin cattle moved through the crossing under Pearl's written permission. Martha Ellison told everyone who asked that Pearl Ramsey had paid every cent she owed. Patrick Doyle found 2 second-hand gate hinges that would still take grease. Lou started saving feed sacks because Pearl said she could use the canvas around the new tack room. Then, one cold afternoon, Patrick came to High Basin with a letter from Fort Laramie. Pearl opened it at the kitchen table. A horse buyer she had known in Missouri needed an experienced clerk to manage accounts and oversee his yard. The pay was good, lodging included, steady work, her own wages, no Sloan, no disputed crossing, no obligation to John Grady. She read it twice. John came in while she was folding it. He saw their letter. Bad news? No. Pearl handed it to him. He read quietly, then he set it on the table. You should consider it. Pearl stared at him. That's all? John looked confused. It's a good offer, I know. Better pay than you'll make here the first year. I know that too. He shifted his weight against the cane. Then you should look at it. Pearl stood. The chair scraped the floor. When you couldn't stand at that creek, you trusted me to decide what mattered. John's expression changed. Pearl, don't stop trusting me because this decision is about you. He went silent. That silence had frightened other people for years. Pearl understood it now. It meant he was holding himself still long enough not to say the wrong thing. She picked up the letter. I'm tired of men telling me which life is best for me. John looked down. After a long moment, he said, You're right. Pearl had expected defense. The apology hurt more. He took his coat from the peg and left. The next morning, Pearl rode to Ramsey Crossing alone. The snow had begun melting along the south-facing slope. She had driven 6 rough stakes into the ground where the first corral would stand. She was measuring the distance between 2 of them when hoofbeats approached. John came over the rise. No second horse, no packed saddlebags, no letter in his hand. He dismounted carefully, still favoring the injured knee. Pearl waited. John took off his hat. I spent years thinking strength meant carrying what other people couldn't. Pearl said nothing. You taught me there's another kind. He looked at the stakes behind her, then back at her. So I won't tell you where you belong. The wind moved through the dry grass. John's hand tightened once around the brim of his hat. I'll only tell you where I want you. Pearl's throat moved. John continued. Here, near me, in whatever house you choose to sleep in and whatever yard you choose to build. His voice dropped. I want you beside me. Pearl looked toward the crossing. And Ramsey Horse Yard? John followed her gaze. The stakes stood crooked in the thawing earth. I'd marry its owner. He looked at her again. I wouldn't own it. Pearl let the silence sit between them. Long enough that John finally looked uncertain. That, more than anything, nearly made her smile. Then she stepped closer. That's a very important distinction. I figured you'd notice. I usually do. John's mouth softened. Pearl held out her hand. Then yes. He stared at it for half a heartbeat before taking it. No crowd, no preacher yet, no grand speech, just 2 hands meeting over ground neither of them had stolen from the other. By spring, Ramsey Horse Yard had its first 2 corrals. A few months later, Pearl rode into Dry Creek Junction on the bench of a supply wagon loaded with tack, fence staples, rope, and enough lumber to finish the training pen. The street looked smaller than it had the day she first arrived. The same courthouse stood at the end of it. The same livery doors opened toward the road. Some of the same faces turned when they saw her. One ranch hand took off his hat. He was the man who had laughed outside that courthouse. Mrs. Grady. Pearl stopped. He looked at the ground. I owed you an apology. Pearl studied him. Then she said, Then don't owe the next stranger one. The man nodded. Across the street, Edward Mills stood outside the mercantile. He and Pearl looked at each other. He touched 2 fingers to his hat. Pearl gave him a small nod. Nothing more was needed. John waited beside the wagon. People still made room for him without thinking. He was still Big Grady. Still the man some people believed could break another man in half if pushed far enough. But Pearl had seen the things no rumor ever bothered to tell: the lowered shoulder beside a frightened mare, the chair pulled out so she could speak for herself, the cane striking the floor when he wanted to stand, but chose to trust her instead. The old paper placed on Albert Crane's desk when keeping it hidden would have served him better. John held out his hand to help Pearl down from the wagon. She looked at it, then she stepped down by herself. Both boots touched the street. Only then did she take his hand. John glanced at her. Pearl looked toward Doyle's livery. "We still need lumber. Patrick says he saved the straight boards. He says a lot of things." John's thumb moved once across her glove, most of them loudly. Pearl smiled. Together they crossed the same street where she had once stood, with Edward's rejection folded inside an envelope. No one laughed now, but that was not the victory. The victory was that Pearl no longer needed the street to be silent. She had her land, she had her work, she had her name painted on the first board above the new gate. Ramsey Horse Yard. And beside her walked a man strong enough to let her belong to herself before she ever belonged with him. Maybe that was what Pearl had been searching for all along. Not a man to rescue her, not a ranch to hide inside, not even a town willing to admit it had judged her too quickly. She wanted the freedom to stand on her own ground and still choose whose hand she reached for. John learned something too. For years, Dry Creek had measured his strength by his size, his silence, and the old stories men told about him. Pearl measured it differently. She saw it when he stepped aside and let her speak, when he accepted her judgment at the creek, when he placed that old paper on Albert Crane's desk, knowing the truth might cost him something. Out on the frontier, strength could keep the fence standing or pull a wagon through bad country. But the kind that built a life between 2 people was quieter. It meant telling the truth when silence would profit you. It meant trusting someone without owning their choices. And sometimes love wasn't the person who promised to give you a future. It was the person who respected the future you were determined to build for yourself. So if you had been standing at Ramsey Crossing with Pearl's choices in front of you, would you have stayed and built a life there? Or taken the road to Fort Laramie? Tell me in the comments. And if stories about dignity, second chances, and unexpected love in the American West mean something to you, subscribe and stay with us. There are more trails ahead, and more stories waiting beyond the next ridge.